They took him in the blue of dawn. It wasn't the sirens or the shouting that I remember most. Those were almost ordinary. There are always sounds in our neighborhood in southern Lebanon, always the distant diesel echo of an armored truck, the muted chatter of men who have learned to keep secrets, and the louder, brittle laughter of small boys playing war with sticks. What broke the shape of that morning for me was the way my father smiled at me just before they pulled him through the front gate. "Be strong," he said, tender as always. His hands smelled of bread and oil and ink. He was a man who read and wrote and taught others how to do small, honest things. He had left the organization in 2006. He had thrown his uniform into the river and come home with a different set of clothes and a different set of convictions. He said he could not live with the brutality anymore. He said God's name did not need to be used as a license to frighten and kill. He began teaching children to read in our courtyard and organizing cleanups and soup for the old. He argued with men of power and charmed old women into singing lullabies again. He believed that justice might be built on small acts. They called him a traitor when they dragged him away. I watched them humiliate him, pushing his face into the dust as if to show us the price of disobedience. They spoke in code. There were men I knew from the market and others whose faces I had never seen. Some wore uniforms that promised righteousness. Others wore the calm of strangers. They took him and left no paper, no accusation, no list of charges. They left our home smelling of iron and my mother's unspent prayers. Disappearances were a thing in our part of the country. Not a rumor, actual people, friends of friends, gone from their beds, their shops, their lives, swallowed by silence. We were not naive. I knew the stories. I had grown up hearing whispered names and warnings and the bite of secrets. But no amount of knowing prepared me for the quiet that sits inside your chest when someone you love vanishes into a state conspiracy of silence. For a long time, I could do nothing but make lists. I cataloged everything, his last words, the exact time the truck blocked our street, the names of the men I recognized, the directions they took. I drew maps in the margins of borrowed notebooks. I read everything I could find about the group that had once employed him. Over the years, their public face had become 1,000 things: parish priest, municipal official, provider of food and clinics, a party with seats in parliament. But the fighter's shadow remained: rockets, bunkers, cells buried like roots under housing estates we walked through every day. They were both political actor and militia. They were deeply embedded, and that embedding, I learned, was what made them so very hard to bring down. My father had told me, before they took him, stories of the organization's beginnings in the early 1980s, how it assembled in the aftermath of invasion, and how it grew with the help of another country across the sea. He never spoke like a man in love with power. He spoke like a man who had watched power harden moral choices into orders. He had been a young recruit once, like so many of his generation. The war had made choices of survival into an ideology. After 2006, when the big war with Israel had burned houses and children in both Lebanon and the north, he came home and could no longer reconcile those fires with the God his father had taught him to pray to. They call themselves the Party of God, he told me once, but to hurt people in his name, that is a sacrilege. So I began to gather evidence. Not guns. Not explosives. Not plans for ambush. My tools were a cheap camera, patience, and the stubbornness of someone who had nothing left to lose. I shadowed movements. I kept lists of license plates that never matched official registries. I memorized faces, and then, because memory is a dangerous vault to rely on alone, I wrote them down. I made records of men and vehicles moving late at night towards specific houses which people whispered were used as arms caches. I recorded the names of men who suddenly acquired new cars, new houses, who offered to pay for funerals of fighters with the same hand that had once held bread. It felt like a pipe dream. The organization controlled everything, or so everyone said. The courts were full of sympathetic faces and empty dockets. Police looked elsewhere. If you named names, you were ruin. If you remained silent, you were guilty in the ledger of the living. And yet the sermon in the mosque reopened something. There was an imam who sometimes sat with us in the tea shop and told stories. On that day his voice was slow and direct. If you have been unjustly treated, he said, and you are helpless, take the matter to Almighty Allah. If you are helpless, take the matter to a higher and more powerful authority that can fight your cause for you. If Almighty Allah fight for you, and a higher authority fights for you, consider that as justice. The words were dangerous. They were also a map. Our small mosque sat opposite the square, where posters of the organization were pasted like declarations. To pray in that mosque was to drink from a chalice in a room full of knives. Yet the imam's sermon felt like a benediction. Higher authority. What did that mean in a place where the higher authority had folded into local power? I left, a candle lit behind my chest. That week my friend told me he had met a man in the ministry, an actual man who claimed to be compiling evidence of disappearances. He said the government was, at long last, taking complaints seriously. I did not trust my friend. I did not trust anyone. But the need to act can make you believe in thin threads. I went to the cafe, where the man said he would meet us. He was not what I expected. He was younger than my father, his hair already graying at the temples. He wore a suit that did not belong to the region, and he spoke English with clipped, precise vowels. His smile was careful. He pulled a small object from his pocket, a smartwatch with a face like polished night. He spoke without theater. We cannot ask you to list addresses, he said. Too dangerous. Too visible. But you know the neighborhood. Your work at the post is perfect camouflage. Use the watch. Press the button when you arrive at a suspect house. It logs location and sends an encrypted pulse to us. We will compile it, and if it is proven, act. He explained more than he should have. He spoke of a quiet office in the Justice Ministry tracking disappearances, of international contacts, of a long list of victims with unmarked graves and broken families. He spoke of risk and the need for discretion. He offered employment at the post office so that our nightly rides would look ordinary. I believed him. I wanted to believe. The work was, in a strange way, simple. I made deliveries. I knocked on doors. I sat on motorbikes in the white heat of afternoon and the sodium amber of our streets at night. When I pulled into a courtyard, I pressed the watch. It hummed and hid the sting of what I was doing. For 6 months, I compiled evidence, made lists, and watched men who had been made to seem invulnerable move like other men, tired, paid for, sometimes laughing. The watch recorded coordinates and times. The watch recorded the rhythm of their lives. Then the watch stopped. One morning, it simply refused to light. I messaged the man from the ministry. His replies evaporated like smoke. The paychecks continued for a while, enough to let us buy plane tickets and leave with passports, until they did not. Then they stopped too. We left Lebanon with our savings because staying felt like staying in the pages of an account book that had been written in someone else's hand. We arrived in another country with our faces and a thin chance at safety. Abroad, I worked in a kitchen and then a factory. I learned the measured grace of places that had rules that were supposed to be just and enforced. I learned to sleep without starting awake at every sound. Sometimes I dreamed of the watch, its sleek face like an eye that had blinked and turned black. In quieter moments I prayed. I prayed that Almighty Allah would fight my cause. I prayed that a higher and more powerful authority would be found. I did not know if prayers could be agents. I only knew they steadied me. Years passed. Life abroad is slow discipline. We learned to make a small household, to study the language, to pay taxes and not worry that an edict could erase us. But the ledger kept calling. I would read news articles about the organization, about their political successes and their military postures, and despite my distance, I could not stop analyzing their structure. They had not been a simple militia. They were, and the history shows this, an institution that had grown from the ashes of conflict into an entity with roots in politics, social services, and a deep military wing. They had fought a long guerrilla campaign to push occupiers out of the South, and emerged with much more than trophies. They had a network of clinics and schools, and a gravely disciplined militia that had learned to fire rockets and hide them in plain sight. They had trained in Syria and they have been described by analysts I read late at night as a hybrid force, somewhere between a state military and a clandestine movement. I found an internet world of activists, journalists, and lawyers. I read long policy papers for the first time. I learned the words they used in courtrooms: command responsibility, war crimes, forced disappearance, state collusion. I studied the anatomy of evidence: chain of custody, corroboration, witness protection. I wrote down legal pathways like a student drawing up possibilities in a margin. The more I read, the more I understood what I had in my pocket when the watch went dead: coordinates, timestamps, patterns, and the missing link was verification and a forum that would listen. The twist came in the form of a short, unremarkable email. It was from a journalist named Eva, an investigative reporter who worked with a small international NGO that tracked disappearances and extrajudicial killings. She wrote, "We have a lead in Beirut and a source who says evidence exists in a safe house. A smartwatch, perhaps. Are you willing to talk?" She had found me through a forum where I had once posted a plea in a half-formed English that is still rusty in my ears. She had written that she believed in building cases that were more than angry words, that she believed in archives, in science. She asked whether I had anything I'd be willing to share. We spoke for hours on the phone. Her voice was roughened by too many late nights and too much coffee, but it was honest. She had prosecuted small cases before, working with prosecutors in other countries and with UN agencies to build files that had weight. Her NGO had forensic partners who could examine metadata. She explained, patiently, what the watch might mean. If it logged coordinates and had an encrypted uplink, she said, we might be able to extract a trail. If we can corroborate with satellite imagery or local witnesses who accept the risk of telling the truth, then the dossier becomes more than a story. It becomes a case. I did not tell her what the wristwatch had recorded while I was in Lebanon. I was too frightened. But I told her about the patterns I had seen in my notebook. I sent her copies of everything I had sketched in margins and typed up late at night: the routines, the plates, the suspicious purchases. She responded with a plan. Her team would go to Lebanon. They had contacts, other journalists, and a local lawyer who believed in bringing cases to the courts. They had an approach to witness protection. They would try to locate the man from the ministry, the one who gave us the watch. He had vanished from my life. Perhaps he had vanished from theirs as well. If we could find that man, perhaps the watch's data could be retrieved. The local lawyer they connected with, Maya, was blunt and competent. She had a legal presence in Beirut and a history of working in dangerous cases. She met the team in Tripoli and then in a rented office in Beirut where the curtains were never fully drawn. She told me frankly that the organization's embedment in Lebanese society made prosecutions difficult. Courts could be compromised, local witnesses could be intimidated. But she had experience with parallel forums, international human rights bodies, UN commissions, special prosecutors who could demand access to evidence if the domestic system proved obstructed. What followed was a year that felt like walking through someone else's memory with a map hand-drawn in another language. The team used every lawful instrument they had: phone analysis experts, satellite tasking requests, old invoices recovered from a burned-out safe. They interviewed witnesses who had the courage to testify because they had fled and because their lives abroad made intimidation harder. They found men who had been low-level couriers and wanted out. They spoke on the record. The watch emerged as a crucial artifact. It had not been a toy. It had been a node in a network, a small black camera that recorded, encrypted, and sent the faint tremor of life in a neighborhood to an unknown server. The man from the ministry, it turned out, had been real. He had been a prosecutor who had tried, years earlier, to use the legal system to fight disappearances. His office had been raided and the evidence dispersed. The watch he had given us was part of a covert evidence-gathering program. He had not been working with the organization at all, as local rumors had suggested. He had been trying to pierce the silence. But there were complications. The watch's uplink had been interrupted. Someone had tried to block the signal, and then the man had gone into hiding. At some point his safe house had been hit in a nighttime raid. His file had vanished. The watch remained, its memory intact even if its connection was broken. The team's forensic experts found that the watch had indeed logged thousands of entries, coordinates, times, short bursts of audio. The data carried names, times of movement, and associations. It carried more than that. It carried the cadence of ordinary life that corroborated witness testimony. We compiled a dossier that read like a chronicle of routine choice. A man who arrived late on a motorcycle with a crate of food, a vehicle that never appeared in any official registry, a house with more water than a family of four would need. We built the pattern into an argument. This was not wild accusation. This was a map. The court of the world is not the same as the courts of a country. It moves slowly and takes evidence more seriously than the men who shout accusations in town squares. We took the dossier to a progression of offices. UN human rights desks, a fragile Lebanese prosecutor who had not yet been intimidated, and then to the desk of a special prosecutor whose job was to assemble cases that local governments could not or would not prosecute. There was opposition. There were men who called the journalist a spy. There were legal maneuvers aimed at discrediting witnesses. There were nights when I would read the newspaper headlines and then feel my hand tremble. The organization had depth and money. It had friends and a way of making doubt seem patriotic. And yet the evidence had a stubbornness. The watch's coordinates matched satellite images of trucks arriving at a house at times corresponding to known attacks. The bank records we could lawfully obtain showed payments from a shell company to men who had been identified in the watch's audio. Then the world shifted. A broader conflict had begun in the region. Tensions which had been simmering for years flared into a new round of exchanges. There were strikes across several cities, and for a while the world's attention narrowed to missiles and rubble. In the new chaos, obscure cases sometimes go cold. Sometimes they find a new urgency. International investigators, who had been tracking violations for years, found in our dossier a string that connected the dots between local disappearances and the organization's shadow networks of enforcement. They began to issue subpoenas. They began to coordinate sanctions. For the first time, an institution outside Lebanon's immediate orbit issued a list of names and a request that they be handed over for questioning. The organization did not fall on that list. No single strike could erase a movement that had built itself over decades. But the pressure that came from international scrutiny and the threat of asset freezes and the freeze of legitimacy made old alliances tremble. Men who had been comfortable in the shade found the light hot, and whether to stay or run became urgent. Several mid-level men whose hands had often done the darkest work while the faces on the posters smiled in official photographs, began to consider bargains. That was the first twist. One of the men whose voice appeared on a corrupted segment of the watch's audio came forward to speak under protection. He said he had been ordered to conceal bodies, to move them from one place to another, to cremate, to bury under the cover of night. He spoke about orders that came from above. His testimony came at a cost, a promise of witness protection, relocation, and a long process of debriefings that cut into the community of shrugs and silence that had sheltered the violence for years. Another courier produced, under pressure, a ledger with dates and names. The legal campaign moved like a slow, grinding engine. The prosecutors compiled the watch's evidence, the witness statements, bank transfers, and photographs into a case that accused a network of local operatives of enforced disappearances and complicity in extrajudicial killings. They argued that while the organization could claim political legitimacy, a chain of command existed that authorized and executed acts in violation of human rights and national law. I watched from an apartment in a city that smelled of rain and old coffee. I was far from my father's house, but the map in my chest, those inked pages I had carried for years, felt like it had finally been useful. My mother and sister, who had lived quietly in our new country, would call and weep sometimes. The process was cruel in its slowness. It required me to submit to grilling interviews, to pieces of my memory being exposed in court transcripts. It required me to watch as the same system that had taken my father now examined my life under interrogation. And then the second twist came. One of the witnesses recanted, publicly, explosively. The organization had found a way to plant doubt. Lawyers called it a complex maneuver, discredit the witnesses, smear the journalists, and immobilize the court of public opinion. For a few weeks, the media fed on the recantation, and officials who were sympathetic began to murmur that the dossier was shaky. The international prosecutor wrote privately that the recantation was suspicious. It had the hallmarks of coercion. We knew, painfully, that it likely was. It was an ugly test. The court demanded corroboration. The watch, which had been our keystone, contained some corrupt data and some pristine files. The corrupted files had been deliberately tampered with. Someone had tried to remove the most damning audio segments. But the uncorrupted segments, the bank records, and the satellite images still held. The case survived. It was a narrower case now, fewer defendants on the table, but it was a case. The court process became public theater. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Flags were waved by men in shirts who said we were traitors to some cause or other. The organization's political wing aired statements about necessary security and sovereignty. There were quiet, grave moments when the lawyers and investigators would speak in private and then come out to tell us that a judge had allowed certain pieces of evidence. That judge, an unassuming woman with a thin, fierce face, would later be praised in quiet corners as one of the few who would look at the evidence rather than the noise. Our case eventually reached trial. I sat in the smallest rows, one of the few people who had a stake. The accused men shuffled in with faces that looked smaller without the mask of authority. The charges, enforced disappearance, unlawful detention, complicity, were read aloud while cameras clicked like flies. The prosecutor played the watch's audio. It crackled. There was no orchestration in those short bursts. Two men arranging a crate, the rattle of a truck, a voice that spoke a name like a command. The coordinates translated into maps and then into images. Trucks arriving, bodies moved, graves dug. It was, in the way courtrooms sometimes are, a reductive moment. All the long years of suspicion compressed into a sequence of clear, damning facts. There were also hearings about chain of custody and the legality of each piece of evidence. Defense lawyers objected. They tried to claim that international actors had tampered with documents. They called the international investigators imperialists. The court allowed cross-examination, and the witnesses sat hunched under heat lamps of public attention. At first, the verdicts were small. A few men received sentences for their direct complicity in disappearances. The organization's higher echelons were not in those docked rows. The truth, and this is a truth that runs through so many cases of political violence, is that structures often survive the curt judgments of courts. But the convictions were not nothing. They were names logged and punished: a clerk who had falsely documented transfers, a field captain who had supervised detentions, a courier who had hidden bodies. The third twist came in a quiet form. One of the mid-level men convicted in the first rounds began to sing, not metaphorically. He began to tell names and dates in exchange for a reduced sentence and safe relocation. He told of how orders traveled up and down the chain, of how the organization's military wing worked with local commanders to impose obedience. He described meetings in which he had heard names and the men who had given the orders. He described the way some in the political wing turned their heads. With each name, the net widened. Arrest warrants were issued. Men who had thought their power could buy them invisibility found themselves blocked from travel, from accounts, from reputations. International partners froze assets in multiple countries. A small bank that had once done the clerical work saw its connections severed, and a director resign in shame. More arrests followed. Some men were detained in the country. Others were apprehended abroad under mutual legal assistance agreements. The organization protested, of course. It claimed the whole thing was a political stunt. Its political allies in parliament rallied in defense of sovereignty and security. There were loud voices that insisted that the courts were being used to attack a pillar of national identity. I think that moment when the world split into slogans and law was when justice stopped being only legal and began to be political. That was the fearful middle of the story. There were nights when it seemed all would be lost, and nights when I slept for the first time without waking in a sweat. There were weeks when I wanted to gather my notebooks and burn them, then weeks when I wanted to shout my father's name until my throat bled. But justice has a peculiar appetite for detail. It is slow, and it is often boring. It is a bureaucracy that moves on a hinge of evidence. It is also sometimes human, not in the sense of mercy, but in the sense that human beings can be moved by other human beings. The families of the disappeared, who had been turned into statistics, found themselves represented in courtrooms by witnesses and lawyers who would not be silenced. As the legal process expanded, so did the social reckoning. Documentaries were released by small film teams that had followed the investigation. They showed the faces of towns that had swallowed secrets. They interviewed mothers who had kept their sons' birthdays for years without candles or cake. They filmed empty houses whose doors were closed because too many neighbors had been frightened into leaving. The organization, which had always relied on the cloak of helpfulness, clinics, schools, funerary aid, found that some of those who used those services began to ask questions. Why had the clinics not helped their grieving families? Where had the money for these schools come from? The seed of doubt spread. I want to be honest, there were setbacks. There were legal hiccups and some witnesses who were too scared to testify. There were international actors who gave up, frustrated by the complexity. We lost pieces of the case along the way. But then, in the slow arithmetic of pressure, things changed. The organization's ability to patrol its perimeter of secrecy was damaged by two things. First, the pressure of legal actions and sanctions that hit its international conduits. Second, a broader regional conflict that had shifted priorities and opened fractures. As I had read in the long policy papers years earlier, armed non-state actors are resilient, but not invulnerable. They are networks as much as fortresses. And when pressure comes on the supply lines and on the political legitimacy, the networks seem sometimes rip. People began to speak who had been silent. A demobilized fighter gave testimony about orders to make people disappear, a smug account of how the organization had buried its misdeeds under a veneer of legitimacy. The man from the ministry was finally located. He had gone into exile after his house was raided and his files destroyed. He came back under safeguard and gave testimony that corroborated the watch's data. He remembered issuing the devices to certain people he believed were conscientious, devices meant to gather evidence when the law failed. He confirmed that there had been a covert program to document abuses and that in the heat of the raids the office had been dismantled. He had survived. He had kept one memory, one link to the evidence, and that link was the watch hidden in a drawer. Justice does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives with paperwork. It arrives with the sober, ordinary ceremony of a judge reading a decision that will be quoted for years and perhaps enforced only in pieces. But the decision started to have teeth. Sanctions were placed on specific leaders and on financial conduits. A set of arrests, less spectacular than the news cycles like, but more devastating politically, rippled through the organization's local structure. Banks closed accounts. Travel bans were enacted. Some men fled, some were detained, some were held to account. In court, the prosecutor did something that made me weep quietly. She read aloud the names of those who had disappeared, the dates and where possible, the faint traces of what had happened. She called for reparations and for a truth commission to be established with international oversight. A truth commission, a forum where families could learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones, was a thing I had not dared to dream of in those earliest days when the truck had blocked our street. It felt like a miracle that a bureaucratic instrument could be so tender. The organization did what defensive institutions do. It shifted narratives. It framed itself as the defender of sovereignty and the provider of social services. It argued that the legal actions were the work of foreign enemies seeking to weaken the country. The public debate was ugly. But the legal facts, the watch coordinates, the bank transfers, the testimonies, stayed stubborn. Evidence does not care for slogans. Finally, after years of proceedings, a string of trials produced convictions not of the very top political leaders, but of the operational commanders and the men who had executed the disappearances at the local level. Several shell companies that had been used to finance obscurantist operations were shuttered. Their assets were frozen and used to fund reparations for families. A small number of senior figures, those who could be linked directly through reliable evidence to command responsibility, faced trials in absentia where appropriate, and extradition requests were deployed. In a few cases, men were arrested abroad and brought to justice. I will not pretend that the organization was destroyed. It remains a powerful actor in Lebanon and in the region, with patrons and supporters and an ideology that continues to have followers. But its invulnerability was pierced in one of the most meaningful ways available to us, a legal and moral reckoning. Small, local networks were unstitched. Men who had believed themselves immune were made to answer, and that had ripple effects. The political wing could not look the same way in public. The organization's capacity to terrorize, at least in those neighborhoods, was made visibly more costly. The final scene of the trials was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No one was paraded in chains for the cameras. Instead, there was a quiet day in a courthouse where a judge read sentences and ordered reparations. Families wept. I cried too, quietly, because the courtroom had a decorum and because the world outside was as brittle as ever. My father's name was in the list of victims, a name that had never appeared on any official roster. The judge acknowledged the suffering and the harm and issued orders for investigations to continue. Afterward, there was a reclamation of memory. Murals were painted in small neighborhoods commemorating the disappeared. The local clinics, funded now by frozen assets and international grants, opened records for families. A small archive was created in a municipal building, with copies of the watch's data, the court papers, and the oral testimonies. It was not a triumph so much as a turning of a page. But for the first time in years, families could go to a place and say, "This happened to my son. This is the record of his life." My mother stood at the edge of one of these inaugurations and prayed. She prayed with the slow, weathered cadence of someone who had survived a long winter. I held her hand and let her lean on me. The satisfaction I felt was not triumphal. It was the gentle settling of a burden. We had used evidence and human courage and the fragile mechanisms of international law to do something that felt like justice. It was not the vengeance the schoolyard boys had fantasized of, the loud and satisfying score. It was the kind of justice that slowly rearranged power and made anonymity more costly for abusers. There was one last twist, a moral one. Some in our neighborhood refused to accept the verdicts. They insisted that the accused had been victims of plot and that the organization was being driven into exile. Others thought the whole exercise was insufficient, that the top leaders should have been tried, and that a foreign hand had too much say in Lebanese affairs. In the silence that followed the court decisions, a quieter conversation began. How do you restore trust in institutions? How do you rebuild neighborhoods where neighbor spied on neighbor for years? The social repair required more than law. It required social programs, truth-telling, and a willingness to center victims, not political narratives. In the years after the verdicts, I started to teach civics courses in community centers. I taught young people about how laws are supposed to work, about the rights we had as citizens, and about how the rule of law, messy and slow and imperfect, could nonetheless be a tool for redress. I taught them how to read public records and to demand transparency from their representatives. The organization still had influence, certainly, but in the small places where I taught there was a different conversation taking root, about accountability and the dignity of people in the law. On certain nights, I would stand on a hill and look down at the old neighborhood. My father's house still had a wobbly fence, but the courtyard was less likely to be empty now. Children ran. Old women argued over tea. There were new murals and an archive binder on a shelf behind thick glass. The watch that had once stopped, its battery drained, its uplink severed, was now lodged in a museum case with a placard in 3 languages. It was, in a small way, an artifact of the courage of those who refused to let the past be a sealed secret. I will not pretend the world is tidy. There are new conflicts. The organization rebuilt in some ways and adapted in others. The regional configuration that supported certain groups changed over time. The politics of my country remained and will remain messy and complex. But the arc of that small story, my father's disappearance, the watch that recorded the ordinary motions of wrongdoing, the international coalition that finally took notice, led to consequences. Men were held to account. Families received apologies and small reparations. Names were no longer just whispers on markets. There was a dignified placing of stones where there had been none. When the watch stopped the first time, I thought that was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was the beginning. Justice, I learned, is not a grand missile or a single speech from a pulpit. It is slow accumulation of records and voices and the stubborn work of people who refuse to accept silence. It is a process that converts grief into testimony and testimony into evidence. It is an uneasy, sometimes imperfect remedy. But when it works, even partially, it makes it harder for men and movements to hide behind divine names and to make murder an act of faith. My father never came home. I do not have a scene in which his face was returned to me. But there was a finality to the legal reckoning, a public naming, that gave me the sort of closure prayer had always pointed toward, a moral ordering in which those who take life in secrecy are made unable to move without accounting. When the men we identified were brought before a court, some quietly in courtrooms, some in prisons in other countries, I felt a kind of satisfaction that was not the glee of revenge, but the calm of a debt finally acknowledged. There is a verse of the Quran my father used to murmur when the nights were long. In Amal Asri Yusra, with every hardship there is ease. I do not think the ease erases the hardship. I think being heard and being recognized is a way the world tries to make amends. For my mother, it was a daily act of returning to the kitchen and making food, of naming our children, of waking early and carrying the weight of ordinary life. For me, it was the archive in the municipal building, the cases closed with names and dates, and the knowledge that a small, stubborn thing, an electronic watch that hummed in the night, had become a witness. There will always be those who say that justice failed because the very top were not tried, or that the punishment never fits the crime. There will always be those who say that the international system is selective and slow. Perhaps they are right. But in the small constellation of our lives, in the way a neighborhood can breathe a little easier when its terrors have faces, justice was served enough for us to mourn with the dignity of knowledge. The final image that remains in my head is of my father's garden. When he was alive, he planted citrus trees and fast-growing herbs. After he disappeared, nobody tended them for a long time. The weeds took the courtyard hostage. Then the women in our alley banded together and began to water the trees again. They trimmed, they planted, they spoke of practical things, how to keep pests off the lemons and when to harvest rosemary. You cannot build an immediate utopia from justice. You can, however, restore small things, a garden, a school, a record with a name. That is how the story ended for us. Not in flames or a single defiant broadcast, but in documents and benches and people coming back to the market. It is not the story the men who love power would write. It is the story the careful people tell, that power can be countered with patience, with law, and with the steadfast belief that speech, when backed by evidence, can be an instrument heavier than any gun. When I close my eyes now, I sometimes imagine my father's hands again, ink-stained, calloused, gentle. I can almost hear him say, as he used to before the dawn of our particular grief, "Hold on to what's true." It was that truth, little by little, that we used to bring the guilty into the light.